A former Navy SEAL living alone in a remote Colorado valley thought he was simply following his German Shepherd through the snow one winter morning. Instead, he discovered a pregnant woman hiding inside an abandoned apple orchard, terrified of someone she believed was hunting her. Everyone said her ex-husband had died 2 years earlier. She insisted he was still alive. What began as a chance encounter would soon lead to secret surveillance, a shocking deception, a historic blizzard, and a desperate fight to protect a mother and her unborn child. Stay with us until the very end. Winter came early to the Colorado Valley, laying a pale silence over the mountains, the abandoned orchards, and the narrow roads where even old ghosts seemed afraid to leave footprints. Ethan Walker had learned to trust silence more than speech. At 35, he carried himself with the stillness of a man who had once lived where one careless sound could cost lives. He was tall and powerfully built, with broad shoulders, a strong chest, short dark brown military-cut hair, a sparse beard along his sharp jaw, and focused gray-blue eyes that rarely missed anything. No scar marked his face, but there were wounds in him that no mirror could catch. He wore his usual long-sleeved green military-style jacket with camouflage sleeves, camouflage pants, a black fabric belt, and old military boots worn soft by years of bad roads and worse memories. Beside him moved Ranger, a 6-year-old German Shepherd, with a black and tan coat, amber eyes, upright ears, and a simple black collar. Ranger was large, disciplined, and quiet in the way only a truly loyal dog could be. He did not bark without reason. He did not wander without purpose. And that morning, he had purpose. Ethan had only stepped outside to check the woodpile when Ranger froze at the edge of the yard. His ears lifted. His body turned toward the far end of the valley, where an old apple orchard sat forgotten beneath a quilt of snow. Ethan followed his gaze. "No," Ethan said softly. "Not today." Ranger looked back once, then started walking. The dog's paws sank into fresh snow as he cut across the frozen meadow. Ethan stood there for a breath, watching him go, then cursed under his breath and followed. Ranger had dragged him toward trouble before. Once to an injured elk trapped in wire, once to a boy who had fallen through creek ice, once to a half-buried truck after a spring mudslide. The dog had a talent for finding what the world had decided to overlook. The abandoned orchard belonged to no one now, or so people said. Years ago, it had produced apples sweet enough to draw families from 3 counties. Now the trees stood twisted and black against the white hillside, their branches bent like old hands reaching for a season that never returned. At the center of the orchard crouched a farmhouse with a sagging porch, boarded windows, and a roof that looked one hard storm away from surrender. Ranger stopped at the porch steps. Ethan saw the first sign then. Smoke. Not much. Just a thin gray thread leaking from a rusted chimney. His pulse sharpened. He climbed the steps, slowly. One board groaned beneath his boot. Ranger stood close at his knee, silent but alert. The front door was not fully closed. A strip of darkness showed between the frame and the wood. Ethan knocked once. No answer. He pushed the door open. The air inside was cold enough to bite. A small fire had burned low in the hearth, more ash than flame. Beside it, wrapped in an old quilt, a woman slept in a wooden chair with one hand resting protectively over her stomach. She was heavily pregnant. Ethan stopped as if the room itself had reached out and gripped him. The woman looked about 31, with pale skin made paler by exhaustion, chestnut brown hair falling loose around her face, and a slender frame strained by the weight of late pregnancy. Even asleep, she looked guarded. Not peaceful, not safe. Her boots were still on. A dented metal cup sat near her feet. A small canvas bag rested beside the chair, packed too neatly for someone who expected to stay. Ranger stepped forward, lowered his head, and gave a soft whine. The woman woke instantly. Her eyes flew open, green-gray and frightened. Her hand moved beneath the quilt, not toward her stomach now, but toward something hidden at her side. Ethan raised both hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." She stared at him, breathing hard. For a moment, She seemed caught between running and collapsing. "This is private property," she said. Her voice was thin, but it did not break. Ethan glanced at the cracked walls, the dead hearth, the snow blowing through a gap near the window. "Doesn't look like property anyone's been protecting." "I am." Those two words landed harder than a shout. Ethan studied her. There was pride in her face, but it was the kind nailed over fear, plank by plank, because fear had been trying to get in for too long. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Hannah Brooks." "Ethan Walker." He nodded toward the dog. "That's Ranger." Ranger sat beside him, calm as an old judge. Hannah's eyes softened for half a second when she looked at the dog. Then the softness vanished. "I don't need money," she said quickly. "I don't need police. I don't need anyone asking questions. That's a lot of things you don't need. I just need to stay here until spring." Ethan looked around the room. No electricity, no proper food except a few cans lined near the wall. No reliable heat, no vehicle outside, no phone charging cable in sight. The farmhouse was not a home. It was a hiding place. "You're due soon," he said. Her jaw tightened. "I know. Anyone coming for you?" The question changed the room. Hannah's face went still. Her fingers curled into the quilt. Ranger's ears lifted. "No," she said. Ethan had heard men lie under interrogation. He had heard soldiers lie to doctors, widows lie to neighbors, and frightened children lie because truth felt too dangerous. Hannah Brooks did not lie poorly. She lied like someone whose life had depended on practice. He took one slow step back. "I have food at my cabin. Firewood, too. I can bring some. I said I don't need help." "No," Ethan said. "You said you don't need money." For the first time, something almost like humor flickered in her eyes. It was small, tired, and gone before it could become a smile. Ranger suddenly turned toward the doorway. His body stiffened. Ethan followed him outside. At first, he saw only snow, apple trees, and the pale road winding toward the lower valley. Then, he noticed the tracks. Fresh tire marks. Wide. Deep. Recent. They cut through the snow near the edge of the orchard, stopped facing the farmhouse, then backed away toward the road. Ethan crouched and touched the packed snow. Behind him, Hannah appeared in the doorway with the quilt around her shoulders. All the color had drained from her face. "You had a visitor," Ethan said. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Ranger moved to the edge of the porch and stared down the empty road, a low growl rising from his chest. In the distance, beyond the bare apple trees, something black moved between the pines, then disappeared. The fresh tire tracks stayed in Ethan Walker's mind long after he left the orchard. He had spent years learning how to recognize danger before it arrived, and something about those tracks bothered him. Whoever had driven into the valley had not been lost. The vehicle had stopped where the farmhouse could be seen clearly through the trees, remained there for some time, then backed away without ever approaching the house. It looked less like a visit and more like surveillance. Over the following week, winter tightened its grip on the valley. Snow covered the orchard in a thick white blanket, and icy winds swept through the rows of neglected apple trees. Ethan found himself returning to the farmhouse almost every day. At first, he told himself it was because Hannah Brooks needed help. The old building leaked heat through every crack. The woodpile was nearly gone, and she was far too close to giving birth to be living alone in such conditions. But deep down, he knew another reason existed. Something about Hannah's fear felt genuine, and Ethan had learned long ago that fear usually had a source. Each morning, he brought supplies from town or from his own cabin: firewood, canned food, bottled water, blankets, and batteries, slowly transformed the farmhouse from a shelter into something that at least resembled a home. Hannah rarely accepted help easily. She insisted on carrying wood despite her pregnancy. She insisted on cleaning and organizing everything Ethan repaired. Pride seemed woven into her character as tightly as the winter scarf she wore every day. Ranger quickly became attached to her. The 6-year-old German shepherd followed Hannah everywhere she went around the property. If she stepped outside to collect kindling, he walked beside her. If she sat near the fire, He settled at her feet. Sometimes Ethan caught the dog, watching her with the same protective focus he had once shown injured veterans during search and rescue operations. Rangers seemed to understand something Ethan did not. One afternoon, while snow drifted softly against the windows, Hannah sat near the fireplace, sewing a loose button onto an old winter coat. Ethan was repairing a broken cabinet hinge when she suddenly spoke. "My baby is due in about 6 weeks." Ethan glanced up. "Boy or girl?" A faint smile appeared on her face. "Boy." For a brief moment, she looked like an ordinary expectant mother imagining a better future. Then the smile faded. "What about his father?" Ethan asked carefully. The room grew quiet except for the crackling fire. Hannah lowered her eyes to the coat in her lap. "He's dead." The answer came so automatically that Ethan knew she had repeated it many times before. He nodded respectfully and returned to his work. The conversation ended there, but something about the way she said those words stayed with him. 3 days later, a winter storm rolled across the mountains. Strong winds rattled the farmhouse walls while snow swirled through the orchard. Ethan had spent most of the afternoon reinforcing loose boards around the barn when Hannah stepped onto the porch beneath the shelter of the roof. "His name was Lucas Grant," she said. Ethan looked up from the hammer in his hand. "My husband." There was a long pause before she continued. "Everyone says he died 2 years ago." The word sounded strange. Not sad, not mournful. Strange. "The police said his truck went into a river during a storm. They found a body. They held a funeral. They closed the case." Ethan waited. "But he isn't dead." The wind seemed to stop for a second. Hannah's eyes never left the snowy orchard. "I know how it sounds. Why do you believe that?" "Because I know him." Her voice hardened. "Lucas never accepted losing control of anything. Not money. Not business. Not people." For the first time since Ethan had met her, genuine fear appeared on her face. "He used to tell me that nobody could ever escape him." Ethan remained silent. "He wasn't violent all the time." Hannah continued quietly. "That would have been easier to understand. Some days he could be charming, generous, funny. Then, everything would change without warning. The entire room would change. You never knew which version of him was coming through the door." Ethan had met men like that before, too many. "He made enemies," Hannah said. "He owed money. He was being investigated. Then suddenly he was dead. Everyone accepted it, except me." "And you've been hiding ever since?" She nodded. The answer sounded unbelievable, yet Ethan saw no sign that she was inventing the story. Her fear felt too old and too deeply rooted. The next morning, Ethan drove into town. Snow covered the roads, and most businesses were nearly empty because of the weather. He stopped at the county sheriff's office and asked about Lucas Grant. The person who spoke with him was Deputy Sarah Whitmore, a woman in her early 30s with chestnut-brown shoulder-length hair, green-gray eyes, and the calm confidence of someone who had spent years dealing with emergencies. She was tall, slender, practical, and known throughout the county for being both fair and stubborn. "I remember that case," Sarah said after searching the records. "You do?" She nodded. "Vehicle went into the river during a storm. Body recovered downstream. Dental records matched." "And there were no questions?" "Not many." Her expression became curious. "Why are you asking?" Ethan hesitated. "No reason." Sarah clearly knew he was withholding something, but she chose not to push. "The file was closed 2 years ago," she said. "As far as the law is concerned, Lucas Grant is dead." The answer should have settled the matter. Instead, it made Ethan even more uneasy. When he returned to the orchard later that afternoon, he immediately sensed something was wrong. Hannah was standing on the porch, motionless. Her face had turned completely pale. In her trembling hand was a photograph. Without speaking, she handed it to him. The image showed Hannah walking through a grocery store parking lot in town. The photograph had clearly been taken recently, perhaps only a few days earlier. She was carrying shopping bags and looking over her shoulder, completely unaware that someone had been watching her. Ethan turned the photograph over. 4 words had been written on the back with black marker. "I know where you are." A cold feeling settled into his stomach. At that exact moment, Ranger stepped onto the porch and began growling. The sound was low and threatening. Hannah looked toward the road. Ethan followed her gaze. The road was empty. The snow was undisturbed. The valley seemed completely silent. Yet for the first time since discovering the orchard, Ethan found himself wondering whether Hannah had been telling the truth all along. The photograph changed everything. Until that moment, Ethan Walker had considered the possibility that Hannah Brooks's fears might have been shaped by grief, isolation, or years of emotional abuse. The photograph removed those doubts. Someone had followed her into town. Someone had watched her closely enough to capture a clear image without being noticed. More importantly, someone wanted her to know she was being watched. For the next several days, Ethan found himself studying the orchard differently. The abandoned rows of apple trees no longer looked merely neglected. They looked useful. The twisted trunks, the uneven terrain, and the thick clusters of brush created dozens of places where a person could remain hidden for hours. The farmhouse sat in the center of a natural bowl, surrounded by trees and hills. It was beautiful in a lonely sort of way, but it was also vulnerable. Hannah seemed to understand that, without anyone saying it aloud. Her anxiety became harder to hide. She checked the windows repeatedly before going to sleep. She locked doors that rarely saw visitors. Sometimes, Ethan noticed her staring toward the tree line, with the expression of someone expecting bad news to arrive at any moment. Ranger noticed it too. The 6-year-old German Shepherd had become increasingly alert. His black and tan coat blended against the winter shadows as he moved through the orchard, and his amber eyes missed very little. One morning, shortly after sunrise, Ethan arrived carrying groceries from town and immediately found Ranger standing rigid near the northern edge of the property. The dog wasn't barking. That worried Ethan more. Ranger only became silent when he was focused. Ethan approached carefully. "What is it?" Ranger's gaze remained fixed on the trees. The wind whispered through bare branches. Nothing moved, yet the dog's body remained tense. Ethan scanned the area for several minutes before finally returning to the farmhouse. He said nothing to Hannah, but later that afternoon he drove into town and purchased several trail cameras designed for hunters, tracking elk and deer through the mountains. The following day, he installed them throughout the orchard. One camera overlooked the road. Another covered the old barn. 3 more monitored different approaches through the trees. Hannah watched him work from the porch. "You think someone is out there. I think it's better to know than guess." She looked toward the forest. "So do I." That night, Ethan barely slept. By dawn, he was already checking the camera footage inside his cabin. Hours passed. Nothing. Then he opened footage from the camera facing the eastern tree line. His stomach tightened. A man appeared on the screen. The image was grainy because of distance, but the figure was clearly human. He stood between 2 apple trees at the edge of the orchard. Tall, motionless, watching the farmhouse. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. The figure remained there for nearly 4 minutes. Then he disappeared into the darkness. Ethan replayed the clip 3 times. The man's face was impossible to identify, but his purpose was obvious. He was watching Hannah. Ethan drove to the orchard immediately. When Hannah saw his expression, she knew something had happened. He showed her the footage. The color drained from her face. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "I told you." Ethan wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her the man could be anyone. A hunter, a trespasser, a curious traveler. But deep down, he no longer believed those explanations. The timing, the photograph, the tire tracks, and now the surveillance all pointed in one direction. Someone was looking for her. That afternoon, Ethan returned to town, determined to learn more about Lucas Grant. The story bothered him because too many details failed to fit together. People disappeared. People faked identities. But convincing an entire community that you were dead required planning. His search led him to a retired private investigator named Walter Bennett. Walter was 68 years old, lean and weathered from decades of fieldwork. Deep lines marked his face. Silver hair curled around his ears, and a neatly trimmed gray beard framed his narrow jaw. Years of tracking insurance fraud, missing persons and financial crimes, had given him sharp instincts and a habit of noticing details others overlooked. Walter listened carefully, while Ethan explained the situation. When he mentioned Lucas Grant, the older man's eyes narrowed. "I remember hearing about that case." "You do?" Walter nodded slowly. "The death was accepted, unusually fast." "What do you mean?" The investigation ended before many questions were asked. Ethan leaned forward. Walter opened an old filing cabinet and removed several newspaper clippings. The articles described Lucas as a successful businessman, struggling with growing financial problems before his supposed death. Walter tapped one paragraph. "This caught my attention years ago." Ethan read silently. Several creditors had been pursuing legal action against Lucas shortly before the accident. His business accounts were under review. A financial audit had been scheduled. The accident happened only 3 weeks before investigators gained access to his records. Ethan looked up. "That's convenient." Very." Walter folded his arms. "If a man wanted to disappear, there are worse times to do it." For the first time, Ethan seriously considered the possibility that Hannah had been right from the beginning. The drive back through the mountains felt longer than usual. Snow clouds gathered overhead. The road disappeared beneath fresh powder. By the time he reached the orchard, darkness had settled across the valley. Ranger met him before he reached the porch. The dog's ears were flat. His body was tense. Something was wrong. Ethan moved quickly toward the farmhouse. The front door stood closed. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows. Yet Hannah was waiting inside, with fear written across her face. What happened? She pointed toward the barn. Neither of them spoke while crossing the snowy yard. Ranger walked ahead, alert and silent. The beam from Ethan's flashlight swept across the weathered boards until it stopped. Red paint, fresh, still wet despite the cold. The message stretched across the barn door in large, uneven letters. "I found you." For several seconds, nobody moved. The words seemed to glow against the darkness. Hannah's breathing became shallow. Ethan looked around the orchard. The trees stood motionless beneath the snow. No footsteps, no vehicles, no visible intruder. Whoever had written the message had vanished, but they had left something behind. Proof that this was no longer about fear, no longer about suspicion. Someone had found Hannah Brooks, and now they wanted her to know it. The storm arrived 2 days earlier than forecast. By dawn, thick clouds had swallowed the mountains surrounding the valley, and a relentless wind pushed curtains of snow across the abandoned orchard. Ethan Walker stood on the farmhouse porch, watching the sky darken long before sunset. Years of military experience had taught him to respect weather as much as any enemy. Storms did not negotiate. They did not care about plans, and the one moving toward the valley looked powerful enough to isolate the orchard for days. After discovering the message painted across the barn door, Ethan had changed the way he approached everything. He reinforced weak locks, checked every window, and installed additional motion sensors powered by portable batteries. The farmhouse remained old and vulnerable, but he intended to make it as difficult as possible for anyone to approach unnoticed. Hannah Brooks watched much of the work from the kitchen table, one hand often resting on her swollen stomach. She looked exhausted. The stress of recent weeks had deepened the shadows beneath her green-gray eyes, yet there was also a quiet determination in her. She had spent 2 years running from fear. Now she was preparing herself to face it. Ranger sensed the change as well. The 6-year-old German shepherd rarely relaxed anymore. His black and tan coat was dusted with snow each time he returned from patrolling the orchard. He checked the tree line repeatedly throughout the day and slept near the front door every night. Several times Ethan noticed the dog staring toward the northern woods for no visible reason. Those moments unsettled him because Ranger's instincts had proven reliable too many times in the past. The first day of the storm passed without incident. Snow piled against the farmhouse walls. Wind rattled the windows. Visibility dropped so low that even nearby apple trees faded into white shadows. Ethan hoped the weather would discourage anyone from traveling through the mountains. Instead, it seemed to create exactly the opportunity their unseen enemy had been waiting for. Shortly after midnight, Ranger rose from his spot beside the fireplace. Ethan woke instantly. Years of habit made him alert before his eyes fully opened. The dog stood perfectly still, ears raised, eyes fixed toward the front of the house. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. Ranger answered with a low growl. At that same moment, a motion sensor mounted near the road flashed on Ethan's monitoring screen. Someone was approaching. The snowfall made the camera image blurry, but headlights briefly appeared between the trees before disappearing again. Whoever was outside had stopped beyond direct view of the farmhouse. Ethan moved quietly through the house, checking each window. Nothing. No movement. No figures. Yet Ranger remained tense. Then another problem arrived. A sharp cry echoed from the hallway. Hannah, Ethan, reached her room within seconds. Hannah was sitting on the edge of the bed, gripping the blanket tightly. Her face had gone pale, and beads of sweat covered her forehead despite the cold. "The baby," she gasped. A painful contraction cut off the rest of her sentence. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. This was too early. The due date was still weeks away. Another contraction followed only minutes later. Outside, the storm intensified. Inside, Hannah was going into labor. For a brief moment, Ethan considered calling emergency services, but the roads were already impassable. Even if help started immediately, reaching the orchard could take hours. "We'll get through this," he said calmly. Hannah nodded, though fear filled her eyes. The next hour became a blur of preparation. Ethan gathered towels, blankets, water, and medical supplies from the emergency kit he always kept in his truck. Hannah tried to remain composed, but each contraction came stronger than the last. Between them, Ranger moved constantly through the house, checking doors and windows before returning to sit beside Hannah. Then, the power failed. Darkness swallowed the farmhouse. Only battery lanterns illuminated the rooms. The timing felt wrong, too convenient. Ethan immediately checked the backup monitor. Several cameras had stopped transmitting. Not all of them, only the ones covering the main road. Someone had disabled them. A cold certainty settled over him. This was no coincidence. Whoever had been watching the orchard knew exactly when to move. Ranger suddenly exploded into barking. The dog raced toward the rear of the house. Ethan followed. Through the snow-covered window, he saw figures moving between the trees. 3 men. One of them stepped closer to the house than the others. Even through darkness and snowfall, Ethan recognized something disturbing. The man moved with confidence. Not like someone searching. Like someone who already knew where he was going. Inside the farmhouse, Hannah cried out again. Outside, the figures continued advancing. Ethan activated every remaining exterior light. Floodlights mounted around the property illuminated the storm in harsh white beams. For a brief second, the nearest man's face became visible. Hannah saw him too. Her entire body froze. "No," she whispered. The word carried more fear than Ethan had ever heard from her. No, it can't be. But it could. The man standing in the snow was tall and lean, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples. Even from a distance, his features appeared sharp and controlled. There was no panic in him, no hesitation. He looked like someone arriving to collect something he believed belonged to him. Lucas Grant, alive. The realization struck Ethan like a physical blow. Every warning, every photograph, every message, every fear Hannah carried. All of it had been true. Lucas signaled toward the house. The 2 men beside him began moving forward. At the same moment, another contraction forced Hannah to grip the bed frame with both hands. The baby was coming. The storm was trapping them inside, and Lucas Grant had finally arrived. The storm raged through the valley like a living thing. Snow hammered against the farmhouse walls, and the wind screamed through the abandoned orchard with enough force to shake the old building. Yet inside, Ethan Walker had no time to think about the weather. Hannah Brooks was in labor, and every minute brought stronger contractions. At the same time, Lucas Grant and 2 men stood outside in the darkness, closing in on the farmhouse that Hannah had hoped would remain her refuge. Ethan moved quickly, but calmly. Years earlier, military deployments had taught him a simple lesson. Panic wastes time. He secured Hannah in the safest room of the house, positioned emergency supplies nearby, and checked the battery-powered radio one final time. Before the storm had intensified, he had transmitted every piece of evidence they possessed to state authorities, including the surveillance footage, photographs, and information connecting Lucas to financial crimes. Whether help could reach them tonight was uncertain, but the evidence was no longer trapped inside the valley. Ranger remained beside Hannah for only a moment before returning to Ethan's side. The German shepherd seemed to understand that two battles were unfolding at once. His amber eyes never stopped moving. Every sound from outside brought a reaction. Every creak of the farmhouse drew his attention. Snow covered his black and tan coat from repeated trips to doors and windows, but he never slowed down. Outside, Lucas Grant approached the porch without hurry. The confidence in his movements explained why Hannah had feared him for so many years. At 42, Lucas remained lean and athletic, with dark hair touched by gray and sharp features that gave him an almost respectable appearance. To strangers, he probably seemed educated, successful, even charming. But Hannah had once described him perfectly. The danger came from his need for control. Cass. He treated people like possessions, and losing control over them felt, to him, like theft. The first blow landed against the front door. Not hard enough to break it, hard enough to send a message. Lucas was announcing his presence. Hannah heard it from the bedroom and closed her eyes. For years she had imagined this moment. Part of her had always feared it would come, yet something inside her was different now. The frightened woman who had hidden alone in abandoned buildings was gone. Fear remained, but she was no longer facing it by herself. Another contraction hit. She cried out, despite trying not to. Ethan heard her from the hallway. Then he heard Lucas, too. "You're coming with me, Hannah." The voice carried through the storm. Even after 2 years, she recognized it instantly. Ranger's growl deepened. The next few minutes unfolded in chaos. One of Lucas's companions attempted to force open a side entrance. Motion lights flooded the area with white illumination, exposing their position. Ethan used every advantage the property offered. Locked gates slowed movement. Floodlights eliminated darkness. Cameras recorded everything still happening outside. More importantly, time itself was working against Lucas. The longer he remained, the greater the chance authorities would reach the valley. Inside the bedroom, Hannah fought through another contraction. Between waves of pain, she found herself staring at the ceiling and remembering the frightened woman she had once been. Lucas had convinced her for years that she could not survive without him. Then he had convinced the world he was dead. Even now, standing outside in the snow, he still believed her life belonged to him. He was wrong. Hours seemed to pass, though in reality, far less time had gone by. The storm remained fierce, but eventually another sound reached the farmhouse. Sirens, distant at first, then closer, much closer. Lucas heard them too. For the first time all night, uncertainty appeared in his face. The evidence Ethan had transmitted before the storm had done its job. State investigators had mobilized, despite the weather. Law enforcement vehicles pushed through the snow-covered roads, following coordinates transmitted from the farmhouse. Lucas tried to retreat. He never made it far. Within minutes, flashing lights illuminated the orchard. Officers moved quickly through the property. Lucas and his companions were taken into custody before disappearing into the storm and the waiting vehicles beyond the trees. The moment the danger finally passed, Hannah's labor accelerated. The storm continued outside, but the farmhouse felt strangely peaceful. Ethan remained beside her, helping however he could. The hours that followed were difficult and exhausting, yet shortly before dawn, a healthy baby boy entered the world. For several seconds, Hannah simply stared at him. Then she began to cry, not from pain. Not from fear, relief. The child wrapped his tiny hand around one of her fingers, completely unaware of the long journey that had brought him into the world. Ranger approached carefully. The German shepherd lowered his head and sniffed the blanket before settling beside the bed. His posture relaxed for the first time in weeks. Morning arrived slowly. The storm finally weakened, revealing a valley buried beneath fresh snow. Sunlight touched the orchard, turning the frozen landscape into a field of gold and white. The months that followed brought answers. The investigation, uncovered extensive financial crimes connected to Lucas Grant. Evidence proved he had staged his death years earlier in order to escape debts, audits, and criminal investigations. His attempt to reclaim control over Hannah became part of a much larger case that eventually sent him to prison. As spring returned, life gradually replaced fear. The orchard changed first. Workers repaired fences. Volunteers restored neglected sections of the property. New apple trees were planted beside the old ones. The farmhouse itself became something different as well. Inspired by her own experience, Hannah transformed part of the property into a shelter for women escaping abusive situations. She wanted others to find the same safety she had once desperately needed. The baby grew quickly. His laughter eventually became one of the most common sounds in the orchard. Ranger became his constant guardian, following him through the yard, lying beside his crib during naps, and positioning himself between the child and every puddle, staircase, or adventure the dog considered dangerous. One warm spring afternoon, Ethan stood at the edge of the orchard, watching workers plant young trees beneath a bright blue sky. For a long time, he had believed he was simply passing through. Staying anywhere felt unfamiliar. After years of loss and movement, behind him, he heard Hannah's voice. She was standing on the porch, holding her son. The exhaustion that had once dominated her face was gone. Confidence had replaced it. "You know," she said softly, "Ranger seems to think this is home." The dog lifted his head at the sound of his name, but made no effort to leave the porch. Ethan smiled. For the first time in years, he realized he agreed with the dog. The orchard no longer felt abandoned. Neither did the people living there. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, angels, or impossible signs. Sometimes they arrive as a loyal dog that refuses to walk away, a stranger who chooses kindness when he could have kept walking, or a small child whose first cry reminds broken people that life can begin again. This story reminds us that fear does not have the final word. No matter how dark the winter becomes, no matter how long we have been running from pain, God can still lead us towards safety, healing, and hope. The people who enter our lives at the right moment may not be accidents at all. They may be answers to prayers we whispered when nobody else was listening. In our daily lives, many people around us are carrying burdens we cannot see. A simple act of kindness, a helping hand, or a few encouraging words can completely change someone's future. Just as one decision changed the lives of Ethan, Hannah, and a little boy born during a storm, our choices can become blessings in the lives of others. If this story touched your heart, please share where you're watching from and leave a comment below. Have you ever experienced a moment that felt like a miracle or an answer to prayer? We'd love to hear your story. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories of hope, courage, faith, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, and fill your home with peace, health, and hope. Amen.